One.
Welcome to The Cutting Edge with Dr. Lee Pierson, Dr. Robert Stubblefield. I'm Steve Richins, and on today's show, we have a title of Key Concepts in Perception. Is perception valid or inerrant? And inerrant is a concept used beginning with Dr. Godhealth and then used in this fine book, How We Know by Dr. Harry Benzwanger. So some of the descriptive text that Lee has here for me is, since concepts are condensations of perceptual knowledge, the validity of all human conceptual knowledge depends on the validity or inerrancy of perception. Now, this is a complicated topic as usual. And so we'd like to thank ARCUK and everybody like and smash those buttons and share. And I'll hand it over to Lee to explain the splash title, which is striking if you have seen it. It's anyway, I'll give it over to Lee. This is
all right. That's what you call that thing. It's called a splash title. I was trying to think, what do we call that thing?
Or a thumbnail. Thumbnail,
but it's the thumbnail's the whole thing with the picture. So splash title. And of course, if it the negative term would be clickbait, but it's not clickbait. That title turns out to be quite relevant. It was given to us by Daniel Krauss, and so he's actually made to my mind, a significant contribution to our discussion today by giving us that question. Even though I believe the question is in a certain sense, well, let's just say it's an equivocal question. Can you trust the census actually has two different meanings? But that's a really important point I want to start with. It's an important point to understand in any discussion of the value and power of perception. That equivocal nature of the senses is important. And I would suggest anytime you see the phrase the senses, and you'll see it all over the place if you look at the literature on perception in objectivism and otherwise, think about whether it's being used in one sense or not. And usually it isn't. It's two things. That is to say that, well, let me refer to the book by my mentor, James J. Gibson, his second book, great book, The Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems. Well, the senses considered as perceptual systems is one sense of the term senses. It's senses as the active acquisition of knowledge by exploratory activities of an organism operating and running around and moving in the world, picking up information actively. And that's distinguished from, in Gibson, the senses considered as channels of sensation, which is to say the momentary sensory impressions, sometimes called sensory qualities is a phrase sometimes used for this. They're not usually pure sensations in the sense of tiny little experiences that are totally separate, but sensory qualities passively received as opposed to actively acquired. Flashes of light you might see, blobs of color, meaningless rumbling or squeaking sounds. But also a coin when you see it on its turned slightly so that it looks elliptical from one perspective, or the railroad tracks that appear not bent, but converging. The stick that appears bent in water. All of these things are really momentary sensory impressions. I would argue they're not really perceptions. None of those things are really perceptions. Those are things that you get from passive contact. To be contrasted with perceptual awareness, which comes from exploration, in which you see a coin. If you walk around it a little bit or twirl it or put it in your finger and feel it, do something active on it, you perceive it as a round coin, which is what it is, of course. The railroad tracks, if you walk up the railroad tracks, walk around the railroad tracks, walk across the railroad tracks, you won't see them as converging. You'll see them as what they are, which is parallel. And the straight stick in the water, or sorry, the so-called bent stick in water, the old chestnut of illusions. The bent stick, if you walk around the stick, it doesn't look the same as a bent stick looks. If you twirl the stick in the water, Gibson pointed this out, you twirl it, it doesn't look like a bent stick. And finally, most definitively, if you pull the stick out of the water, it's not going to look like a bent stick. So these active processes give you an actual perception, a valid perception of, what it really is. So I want to distinguish those two things. Can you trust the senses? Are we talking about trusting the senses as channels of sensation, passive input? Or are we talking about trusting the senses as perceptual systems, actively acquired information in the world, which is, how we get actual perception and actual awareness of the world? Now, I would say, okay, so that brings us to the question, how can we describe this trust? What's the nature of the trust? Especially in perception. And I think it's a little different in both cases. Yes, you can trust the senses in both cases, actually. You can trust the passive senses in a certain way, and you can trust the senses considered as perceptual systems. So taking the passive senses first, when you experience a flash of light, whether it's something, and maybe it's some kind of explosion and you see a flash, or if you press the side of your eyeball. Anybody ever tried this? Some people are afraid to do it. I mean, don't press on the eyeball itself, but on the skin there. If you press on it, you will see a little flash of light kind of on the other side, because you are stimulating the neurons there that are light sensitive. And so you see you see some light. You can try that yourself. Well, in those cases, regardless of the cause, whatever the cause happens to be, if you experience a flash of light, you experience a flash of light. In that sense, it is entirely trustworthy. You can't say, no, I didn't experience a flash of light when you did. Nobody else can tell you you didn't experience a flash of light. So in that sense, it's kind of a trivial sense. But in that sense, the passive senses are entirely trustworthy. If you have an experience, you've had the experience. More importantly, though, you can trust the active senses, the senses considered as perceptual systems, because there again, if you're able to go out and go around and pick up the information in the light, and we've discussed Gibson before. I don't know. I don't want to do too much on this today, but there is the stimulus energy that's available to you in the world, particularly in light, is tremendous. And it gives you, if you can tune into that energy, which perceptual systems can, that energy specifies all kinds of features of the world. And that, really guarantees that you're going to be able to perceive the world because of the structured stimulus energy, particularly in light, that comes off of the things in the world. I mean, at a basic level, perception, the validity, I'm using that term already. Okay, the validity of perception is axiomatic. It's really an undeniable truth, because the attempts to deny it will end up making use of it. And I'm not going to pursue that point further right now, but we can understand how perception arrives at valid knowledge of the world. If you understand that the world is, that we are in a sea of energy that we can sample and that has structure, and the structure that it has comes about from its interaction with the objects in the world. So we have a source of valid information, about the world, but you have to go out and get it. It doesn't, passively, it doesn't work. I'm going to come back and say more about this later, but I think I'll leave it at that for now.
So one interruption, Lee.
Yes, sure. Please go ahead. Yep.
That is just to reiterate, but maybe put it in my language.
Okay, great.
Talking about that in one sense of the senses, it's talking, you say static. And what you mean is like it's an instantaneous thing. And it's really a focus on each individual sense. Whereas
That too.
Gibson says it's over time, and it's a word you hate. It's an integration of all of them at the same time.
Well, he would never use that word.
I know.
But I'll use a word that he or his some of his followers would use in this connection. Multimodal. It's multimodal. You can pick up the information in different modes. So, for example, if there's a ball out there, a round ball, you can see the ball is round, and you can detect the roundness of the ball by rolling it around in your fingers, in your hands. And Gibson says that you get the same information in both cases. So that's, and you don't really have to integrate it. It's the same information. The world is already integrated, and the information is already there. So Gibson doesn't see the need for the term integration in this connection, but you can get it from different sources. And there is some, gets us off of track here, but there's some reason to believe, I think maybe Bob's going this way, that we really need multiple modalities to perceive the world, to get a full perception of the world. I think there's something to that. Okay, so we talked about that you can trust the senses, but here's what you can't trust. You can't trust what happens when somebody confuses one of these things with the other. If you confuse momentary sensory impressions with perceptions that you get by active movement over time, if you confuse those things, you can make mistakes. And I will come back to that point later. But that's where there is something that you can't always trust that everything's going to work perfectly, because it's possible to have that kind of confusion. And when that happens, so if somebody looks out and sees a person, supposedly the young Helmholtz did this. Hermann von Helmholtz, the great genius of the 19th century, who studied perception among many other things. Allegedly, the story goes, when he was a young child, he saw people far away, and he made some comment to the effect, maybe to his mother or somebody, "Oh, it's little tiny people out there, little tiny people out there." Well, of course, they're not tiny people out there. They're just people that are far away, and therefore subtend a smaller visual angle to your eye. Now, people don't usually make that mistake, but if you do make that mistake, and I'm not sure that Helmholtz really did, but if you do make that mistake, you are confusing a momentary sensory impression with an actual perception over time, and pickup of information over time, which would tell you there is information in the light that specifies that they are just human beings of the normal size. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the two alternative ways of describing the trustworthiness of perception, and sensation, actually, and sensory qualities. You could use these for both. The important one to me is perception, of course. So one possible word, and it has been used recently in the objectivist literature, is inerrant, which means, according to the dictionary, Merriam-Webster anyway, free from error. Okay, I think historically, I believe, I didn't research this really carefully, but I believe this has most often come up before in a religious context. At one point, it was used to describe what the Pope says, but the more common phrase or word for that is infallible. When he's sitting there on the throne, ex cathedra, as they say, and he makes a pronouncement, that's allegedly infallible. But in the 19th century, it had a broader usage in Christian religion, with the Protestants mainly, referring to the Bible. Because the Protestants are more insistent that you go to the Bible. You don't go to the Pope, you go to the Bible. So the Bible is considered by some Christian theorists to be inerrant. which means in their usage, it means either free from error or cannot make an error. Those are slightly different. And they have, arguments for which it is. And then some people say the Bible isn't inerrant. Now, there we're talking about, I think, a concept that I understand. It's misapplied because I don't think the Bible is inerrant myself. Bob, do you think is the Bible inerrant? Okay.
No.
So Steve, he doesn't think that anymore. Do you, Steve? Well, anyway, so the Bible is not inerrant, but I understand how the concept applies because the Bible is a verbal, it's made up of words and the words convey meanings. And so the question is, are those meanings true or false? Are they correct? And so to say that it's inerrant is to claim that what the Bible communicates to you verbally is true. So I understand that. Now, in the objectivist usage, first of all, one point I think is important here is worth mentioning. It's not used by Ayn Rand ever. As far as I know, and I've had my research staff hard at work on this one. Maybe somebody will find us somewhere, but certainly not in print. And I don't think I don't know of any reason to think that she ever used it at any time. More recently, by the way, she used the term valid. The senses are valid. That's what she says in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, for example. Recently, though, the term inerrant has cropped up. The book on concepts from 2013, Alan Godhelf. I think Alan Godhelf used the term, Steve, by the way, I think he used the term unerring, which is, I guess, the same idea, but not the actual word. But by the time we get to Harry Binswanger's How We Know, there's a whole section of 6 pages on perception as inerrant. And it also crops up in a couple of the articles, at least, in the companion to Ayn Rand book, but kind of in passing. And it comes up there kind of without comment. So I don't know exactly where this comes from. We'll have to ask Harry if if it's due to him. I don't know. Bob, do you have any idea where this inerrant thing? But it did creep up from. It came from somewhere. It came from beneath the sea. I don't know. It came from somewhere. This term inerrant, but it's not used by Ayn Rand. Now, why would this term be used, inerrant? Because, as Harry explains, the senses are mute. Well, he got this actually from one of these British language philosophers. I'm not thinking which one offhand, but one of these guys, maybe Austin, it's probably John Austin, but somebody like that, one of these language philosophers. The senses are mute. They don't talk. Okay. It's in the same way like rainfall doesn't talk. It just falls on your head. It doesn't tell you anything. It's, all that, those kinds of things are mute. Well, yes, literally perception tells you nothing because it's not verbal. The information in the light doesn't come to you in the form of words, not to me anyway. So that's true as far as it goes. But perception is informative. It does convey knowledge about the world. For example, I can perceive that I can walk through a given open doorway or not if it's too short, but I can walk through it if it's right. I can perceive that, and that's knowledge from the world conveyed to me by perception. It's not in a verbal form, but it's genuine knowledge. So I've gotten something out of it. So I would say, Bob, you want to jump in on that?
Yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
Okay. Please let me know when you do. Same to you, Steve. I see they're busy there doing something. All right. So I was just going to keep going then. So I would say inerrant is not wrong exactly. It's inadequate. It cannot properly replace valid, in my view, as a description of the cognitive status of perception. Because it doesn't, inerrant focuses on the negative. It focuses on what perception does not do, does not make errors. But the question then is, what is positively given to us by perception? And so just identifying what perception cannot do, not what it can do, doesn't really get to the essential. You should focus on what you get, not so much on what you don't get. All right, I think at that point, anybody want to comment on that issue at this juncture?
What would you say the motivation is? I mean, ultimate clarity, but for this to be a key concept for you, because perception is such a important issue that's, you know, been, if I say unresolved, it's too strong, but it's a controversial, the most controversial issue in the history of philosophy, hands down. That might be an overstatement, but
what about free will?
Okay,
But
yeah.
let's not get into free will yet. But okay, I get that. Sorry, go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
So with that said, that's the motivation. Did I just state it's just such an important
let me see.
issue?
I might have lost the thread there for a second in your question, but so I'm going to interpret it, and you can fix my interpretation. But if you're talking about why would people want to use the term inerrant, that I think,
or not, yeah.
You know, this is speculation, and we don't want to psychologize or anything. But what it seems to me is the issue that people are thinking about, for example, Harry, is a legitimate issue. That is the grounding of human knowledge, foundation. The issue that the philosophers call foundationalism. You know, does not human knowledge have a firm, unchallengeable base or not? And that's a controversy. Well, objectivism holds that it does. So that's perception. But we also notice that there are all kinds of things that appear to be errors, and you have to explain that. And usually the explanation given in objective sources has to do with conceptual judgment as to where errors come from. But then what is it about perception? How can you describe perception as not subject to error? Well, because it's inerrant, meaning it's not the kind of thing that could even in principle make an error. I think that's the motivation. But the problem is the kinds of things that in principle can't make error are, generally speaking, not forms of cognition. So it is true that rainfall, Harry doesn't actually say it this way. He doesn't actually come out and say it, but I think it's true that rainfall could be described as inerrant. It doesn't make errors, but it also is not a form of cognition. And the problem is forms of cognition, there are always possibilities for error. And when you have an awareness of the world, that could be a mistake. It turns out we have to explain how that works without undermining the inerrancy of perception, the validity of perception. Now, I'm going to try to do that a little bit later, but I think that's the motivation that motivates inerrancy. But to me, it throws out. It's a classic case of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Because you get this inerrancy at the price of cognition, the price of perception giving you any information about the world. That's why there's all this talk about it doesn't tell you anything. It's mute. Okay, but then you have to immediately, you should follow up with that if properly with it does convey information. Now, I don't see Bob wants to jump in here.
Well, let's think of an analogy with in the field of ethics as opposed to epistemology. So you can talk about rocks cannot be moral, nor can they be immoral.
Right.
On the other hand, a rock can fall on you, and that can have a negative effect on you. So is there a word in the field of morality, like if you talk about amoral, you say you're really saying here's an individual who could be moral or could be immoral, but he's not going to pay any attention one way or the other, but it still has the possibility of being that. So that strikes me as like this thing that you're talking about, knowledge. You know, this could be knowledge. It could be correct. It could be incorrect.
Yeah.
Whereas rain doesn't have anything to do with knowledge.
Right. That's correct. I think the word that would describe the rock maybe would be, perhaps, I'm just speculating, but how about non-moral? A rock is a non-moral, something that's non-moral in nature. Because as you said, amoral really refers to somebody who could be moral, and immoral is evil, and it was a kind of moral position. So you can't refer to those things, cannot refer to rocks. Rocks are also not bald because they don't have the possibility of hair. You know, that's a well-known philosophic chestnut too. So let's see, how does that apply here? I think inerrant just doesn't do the job because it doesn't tell you what perception can do. It leaves that kind of hanging, and in order to work in the way that that those who use it want it to work, it has to be non-cognitive. I think it has to be non-cognitive because cognition, in cognition there is a possibility of error. When I say you look at the doorway and I can see that I can walk through it, it's possible to make a mistake about that. And I've seen animals make mistakes. I don't make that mistake, of course, but I've seen animals get stuck. You know, so an animal walking through a hollow log might get stuck. Now that's a mistake. What is that? What's the nature of that mistake? You see, I think that's the problem that people want to solve by referring to inerrancy. But by doing inerrancy, you eliminate the cognitive aspects. I have a different explanation for how error arises, which I'm getting pretty close to talking about. So I think Bob wants to jump in again.
Well, no, you can go ahead, but I was going to comment that every time I go in the crawl space, I put a hard hat on because I sometimes walk into the ceiling.
Yeah, because you don't always pick up enough. One of the problems is you don't always pick up enough information. So that's just a matter of insufficient. But there's also a more active sense of error than that, even. Okay, so valid. Valid means well-grounded or justifiable. Being at once relevant and meaningful. I like that, being at once relevant and meaningful. So that perception is definitely relevant and meaningful. That idea is not conveyed at all by inerrancy. And I think if it did convey it, it would remove the reason why people are going to use inerrant. So we have to explain that. But that's what valid in the dictionary means. So the deliverance.
Yeah, I don't get that.
You don't get that?
You're going to explain.
Well-grounded. I don't know. It's a dictionary. It's just a dictionary. But well-grounded. Well, perception. I touched upon this, and I said I wasn't going to really talk about this too much. But perception is basically the grounding. The philosophic grounding is axiomatic. It's an axiom. It's the consciousness is conscious axiom. And any attempt to deny it, ultimately, I think you'll find will use the concept of perception somewhere. That's what Ayn Rand had in mind when she says, I think, in ITOE, she says, the attacks on the senses are just variants of the stolen concept fallacy. So they use a concept which they ultimately end up trying to deny. And that's the nature of axioms. So philosophically, it's an axiom. But also we understand psychologically, as psychologists, if you've read Gibson, we understand that perception is an active process that goes out and gets information, and the world is rich with information. There's all kinds of information, structure in the light and sound, structure that specifies entities and their attributes, and it's really very dense. In the mathematical sense of the term dense, you can always get more information, or nearly so anyway. You can always get more information. So there's plenty of reason from the psychological standpoint to understand why perception is valid, considered as an active process where you go out and acquire it. Not if you sit there passively, then you're not going to get that information and you're going to have trouble. Let's see. Yes, light. So perception can give you correct knowledge of reality. I say can because it's an active process. Gibson doesn't use the term process for him. An activity of the organism to go out. You have to go out and get the stuff. It's an achievement. It's not just imposed upon you. You don't just sit there. Now it's true. People say, I sit there and open my eyes and I see. Well, there's a certain truth to that. But if you really want to see the world and really perceive it, in its fullness, you have to move around. You have to look. You have to change your attentional gaze. You have to move your body. You have to do and take some time in doing those things.
You have to absorb the context more with that.
Well, you could absorb the context. Maybe you could say. I mean, that's a way, but you have to pick up more information. The information is out there. The information doesn't get into your inside you, so to speak. You don't acquire the information by just sitting there. You get very degraded information by just sitting. It has to be an active process. All right. So anything else? Bob's thinking. He's thinking. Okay. So
Let me give
yeah, go ahead.
Let me give this super chat.
Oh, good.
We got a super chat from Robert Naser. Thank you, Robert.
Oh boy, Robert.
I watched his show today about open systems with James Valiant. I thought it was excellent. Thanks for your support. And back to you, Lee.
What? Oh, he doesn't have a question? No comment?
No, just a comment. Oh, yeah. Yes, comment. Good to see Team Pierson back at work. Sorry, yes.
All right. It's the triumvirate, you might say, if you want to put it that way. But okay, thanks, Robert. All right, so error. Why is it that perception per se, as such, can't be wrong? Now, I'm going to give, this is my explanation. So we're out in the, I'm sticking my neck out here, but this is what I think, and we can discuss it. As I said, there are two senses in which the senses are trustworthy, are not subject to error. There are two senses. Sensory qualities are themselves inerrant. So when if you hear a pitter patter sound, that's what you hear. There's a passive response to stimulus, and perception, as I said, I claim is inerrant. We'll say, valid is the better term because it tells you something. When you go out and do the work necessary to acquire, to get the information that specifies things in the world. However, when they are confused, when sensory qualities, the passive impressions are confused with perceptions, then you get error. They lead to error. So let's take, I mentioned the coin, which appears elliptical if you have it at a certain angle, as a momentary sensory impression. And somebody might confuse that momentary sensory impression with perception and say, hey, the coin that coin is not round, that coin's an ellipse. Or somebody might say the railroad tracks meet actually out there, if they adopt that attitude and they're not and don't actively pick up information. And it's not, by the way, it's not the saying that's important here. It's the awareness. It doesn't really matter whether it's put into words or not. I want to clear that out of the way. So those can cause errors. I have, I think, a really good example to further discuss this, which is the infamous Ames room. I think we've talked about the Ames room a little bit before. Didn't we, Steve? Did we talk about the
Ames room? Yes, we have.
I think we did. But anyway, briefly, most people know what the Ames room, most people at least heard of what the Ames room is. So let me just remind you, but you can always look it up, on the internet if you want to check it. But the Ames room is a structure. It's a room but it's built in the form of a trapezoid instead of the usual square or rectangular shape that a room has. It's made in as a trapezoid. And so, and it has a little peephole on one wall. There's one little, you look through the little peephole. And because it's trapezoidal, but there's no information in the light that comes to your eye, your unmoving eye, about the trapezoidal structure. Because of that, it looks like a regular square room when you look through the peephole. And as a result, and again, if you want to get the details, look it up on the internet. As a result, when you have people standing in there, you can have two people of the same, that are actually the same height, but one of them looks really, really tiny and the other one looks like a giant because of where they are, you know, in the back of the trapezoid. And that's the way it looks to you as a momentary impression through a peephole. And that's a mistake, I guess you could say. I mean, see, again, as a sensory impression, it's not a mistake. That's what you experience. You experience it that way. That's what you experience. You experience a sort of a big patch and a small little patch, in the shape of people. Anyway, however, if you come out from behind that peephole and walk around and walk into the room and walk around the room even a little bit, the illusion, quote unquote, the quote unquote illusion will disappear entirely. It will disappear completely if you pick up more information about it. It only occurs because you are reduced in the original situation. You're reduced to a kind of momentary sensory impression.
Snapshot.
Yeah, snapshot, which is not the way. Now, notice that awareness is not captured by any particular image or any particular form. It's not. I'm going to say something probably mysterious, but I'm just going to throw this out. Perception, real perception, is formless and imageless. Your awareness of that the sizes are equal when you go in there and you see they're twins. If they're, let's say they're twins and they're the same height, you know, even though they look different when you look at the people. When you go in there, that awareness has no form. It has no image associated with it. It was information picked up over time. Is just sort of a pure awareness. You are aware, though, that they're the same, and that's a perceptual awareness. So, and it's not solved. That situation is not solved by a conceptual judgment. It's not that you made a conceptual error when you look through the peephole, and then you solve that by some kind of thought process of reversing your conceptual error. The thing is resolved by picking up actual perceptual information, going beyond that momentary sensory impression. That's how you do it. And it's the same with the railroad tracks or the coin. The coin is not when you see the coin as an ellipse, and again, it's not verbal. It's not the words that count here. You see a certain shape, and you find out later by exploration that it's not that shape. It's a circular shape. Now, again, the words are not the issue here. I need words to describe it, but the awareness is not words. So the correction is not a correction of a conceptual judgment. It's the pickup of perceptual information that corrects that impression, that momentary impression. The same with the railroad tracks. And I think it's the same with the bent stick. I'm not sure it's the same with everything that's called an illusion. You know, J.J. Gibson taught me, and he knew a lot more about this stuff than I ever will. He taught me that illusions don't have one explanation, and I'm trying to give it one explanation, but I think it covers a lot of things. There are some of the things that are these days that come out as illusions. A lot of them are physiological in nature, and so the explanation maybe has to be cast in somewhat different terms. But I think that this is at least a good first cut on how perceptions are not wrong. What's wrong is confusing a sensory impression with a perception. All right. You guys want to have any further? Bob's got something, I'm sure. He's got something he wants to jump in here on.
Well, I start to understand why you are opposed to the term inerrant. By analogy with the ethical situation again. Because if you talk of a robot as being outside the realm of morals, then yeah, that's true. But the robot is also outside the area of volition. Whereas when you are talking about knowledge, cognition, if you now say that the senses, which are an element of cognition, or a type of cognition, if you say that they're outside the area of knowledge, that's what you're saying when you say they're inerrant. You're saying they don't belong into the field of knowledge. And yet that's the contradiction that you're opposed to. They do belong to the field of knowledge.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, are you finished, Bob? I'm sorry.
I finished with that point, yes.
Okay, all right, for the moment. So that's what I was trying to get at by the idea that the senses, quote unquote, that phrase is an equivocation. Because the senses considered as channels of sensation don't give you knowledge of the world. Now as you were talking, I realized, yeah, they give you there is a certain kind of knowledge involved, even in sensation, but it's very primitive, and it's just more about yourself. It's about the state of your receptors than it is about, because you get a light flash, you see a flash of light, you don't know the cause of the flash of light just from that flash. It could be the sun, or it could be pressing on your eyeball, or something else. So that it's knowledge, maybe in a very primitive sense of knowledge. It's not knowledge of the world. Perceptual knowledge. Yeah, go ahead.
It's knowledge in the same sense that ones and zeros in the computer are knowledge.
I think it's a little better than that.
It's interesting that Ayn Rand does not talk about the senses as being knowledge. She says knowledge starts with perception.
Well, what does she mean? See, I hope that's true, but what does she mean when she says the senses are valid? Because that's the phrase in ITOE. She does actually use that phrase.
I think that all she means by that is that if it's a one, it's a one. If it's a zero, it's a zero.
No, I don't think that could be the full explanation, because then how would that connect to the stolen concept fallacy? Why would objections to that idea be a stolen concept fallacy? Why would you be you be using the concept of zeros and ones in that way? Why would the stolen concept fallacy get involved there? I think rather that she's means to refer to actual perceptual knowledge. We're only talking about a short sentence, in two sentences, because there's a following sentence. So it's hard to know for sure, but I don't see how that she could just be talking about the meaningless aspect of the senses there.
But she talks about the perception as being just an automatic integration of sensory information.
Yes, which of course, now, as you know, I think that's the big mistake in the objectivist theory of perception, is to start that way.
That's because you have a particular meaning of integration.
No, it's not. It's not primarily integration that's the issue there. It's the idea that perception, it goes back again. This is what I think anyway. Back to Gibson's book, Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems, which I think was the most important thing in perception for an objectivist to read, is that book. Because he's making the distinction between the senses considered as perceptual systems versus senses considered as channels of sensation. He explicitly makes the distinction, and his point is perception is based on the senses as perceptual systems, as active acquirers of knowledge, and the senses considered as channels of sensation, according to Gibson, those are irrelevant. They have nothing to do, Gibson would say, I think that has a little bit to do with it, but it has nothing to do with perception. Perception is not based on integrating sensation. That's exactly what he denies, or even using sensation. It's true, the word integration, he rejects that, and I reject it. That is true. But the more important thing is he rejects the idea that perception is based on sensation, on any kind of operations, whether you call them integration or whatever you want to call them. They're not based on operation. That is, there's no intermediate stage of sensory qualities that you're aware of that is then turned into a perception. Perception is direct, according to Gibson, it's a direct awareness of the world based on information in the structure of the stimulation in the light. And that's not even in consciousness. Your awareness of the world is in consciousness.
Every bit of information that comes in through senses.
Yes, but see, once again, we're back to that's the equivocation. Of course, that's true. And Gibson, and you've read Gibson, so you know that Gibson even says that very explicitly. But he means the senses as perceptual systems, not the senses as the passive recipient of signals from outside. That as the passive signal, he says they share. The systems share, neural process, some neural processes, but they're two different systems. And the first one, the sensation system, according to Gibson, has nothing to do with perception at all. So keeping in mind limiting this equivocation is very important here. Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well,
he wants to think.
Several thoughts are crossing my mind.
Okay.
I believe that you are constraining Ayn Rand's words to mean something different from what she meant. She talks about consciousness being an active process, and perception is part of consciousness. Perception is active. Active is something that takes place over time. So I don't believe that she's referring to the theory of integrating sensory qualities as distinct things. I think she's referring to the fact that the human system puts together, if you will, all these signals that are coming in, and its own action in processing those signals, and its own action in moving to detect other signals. And that's what results in perception.
Okay. Now, of course, Gibson disagrees with that view also, but I don't think that's the.
So.
I guarantee we'll have to talk about probably more in Clubhouse about that. But having studied for him with years, I know he many times denied the idea of signals. Many over and over again, he denied that what that's processing of signals is the basis of perception. I mean, he did it time after because he thinks it's the extraction of invariance from the flow of stimulation, which is not the same thing as putting together a bunch of signals. It's a different process. But that's kind of where it's a little bit of arcane. The three of us here have all read Senses Considered, and probably most of the audience hasn't. So I don't know if any of this is, but we can talk about it some more. But I know Gibson would disagree with that. But also,
he would disagree with the words for the same reason you disagree with the words.
Well, it's not. We're not just talking about what people call semantics. We're talking about something that is an actual difference in what's thought of as the process. But I was going to say, in addition to that, perhaps more to the point, that is not the objectivist theory. That is definitely not the objectivist theory, at least as interpreted by Leonard Peikoff. And notice we don't have if you when Ayn Rand says perception is the integration of sensations by the brain of a living organism, animal, or something like that. The integration of sensations, automatic integration. She doesn't explore that any further, doesn't really discuss it. It does not discuss. How does that work? We don't know. Yeah. Nothing.
She starts with perception.
But what Leonard Peikoff does is he does, and which Ayn Rand, I don't think, I'll have to get this research too, but I don't think Ayn Rand did what he did here, which is to explain explicitly what is meant by sensation. And Dr. Peikoff in OPAR says a sensation is an irreducible response. Well, I can't give the exact words probably. An irreducible response of a sense organ or receptor to a stimulus or something like that. An irreducible an irreducible state of consciousness. The point is that a sensation, the point to get here is that it is a state of consciousness. The sensation is a state of consciousness, it's not a state of the nervous system. The word sensation is another one of these words. Equivocation is rampant in the world of ideas. Sensation is constantly equivocated upon I don't mean just in objectivism, I mean all over the place in psychology and philosophy. And sometimes people are talking about conscious experiences. Sometimes other people will talk about the transmission of signals in the sensory nerves, neurons, and sometimes they kind of go back and forth. Nowadays, the transmission of signals in the sensory neurons is much more common because most scientists nowadays are materialists, and they believe all there is the physical stuff. So they just want to talk about physical stuff. So if you talk to a neuroscientist and ask what a sensation, they probably don't even use the term as much anymore as they used to. But if you ask, it would be something along the line of a signal. But that's not what it is in objectivism. It is an irreducible conscious experience. Go to OPAR and you'll see I'm right. Check OPAR. Steve's been doing it, right? You've been checking? No, he hasn't. All right, so you check it.
Well, I am reminded.
When we get to Clubhouse, I think I've got a couple of OPARs around here. Yeah.
Lee, I am reminded of Robert Ephraim's article, which gives 7 definitions of, sensory sensation, and it's when it's used, people generally don't know what they're talking about unless they do some reflection on it. I know that's for my own introspection.
That's right. You're right. Thanks for bringing that up, Steve. Article by Robert Ephraim called "What is Perception?" Is a very interesting article. Very interesting article. He gets a long way without knowing any Gibson. He gets quite a ways, more than anybody else. And he does have this section of explaining why sensation is basically not a good term to use because of the various meanings. I only gave kind of more or less 2, but he has, as you said, Steve, he had 7 or something. And
I think so.
Interestingly, Ayn Rand read this article. I know she read the article because I've seen her handwriting comments on it. I think that's right. I think I have. But she didn't exactly apply it to the objectivist definition. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it happened afterwards, or I don't know how that happens. But anyway, Ephraim makes the point. And his point is that sensation basically boils down to you shouldn't be using it in your theoretical discussion. I think that was what he was arguing. At least, certainly that's what I would argue. And that is what Gibson argued. Gibson argued that. So go ahead, Bob.
Well, I noticed we're almost out of time.
Yeah, we're getting pretty close, which is good.
And I think you've actually made your point about inerrancy being insufficient, in that if you apply inerrancy to perception, to the senses, then you're saying that really it's outside the field of cognition.
Yeah, or at the very least, you're not affirming it. Yeah, it's a little, at the very least, and it should be, whether it's denied or we're really close to stolen concepts here, because when you have a stolen concept, you don't have to deny it. You just have to ignore. And I think that the cognitive power of perception is seriously ignored, if not denied. But there's a reason to think it's denied too. But it's in the literature, it's a little unclear on that point. But anyway, yes, inerrancy is insufficient, and it's partly because it's a negative term. You should expect that it shouldn't be the right way to describe something, because normally you don't describe things negatively unless there's something that necessitates it. So baldness is described negatively because that's the nature of the thing, but otherwise you should describe things positively, right, Bob?
Yes.
So let's see. Steve, anything else? I don't know. We'll see what time it is here. According to my watch, we still have a minute or two. You got something, anything else you want to throw out here?
Well, you said sensory data, if I'm right, or correct me, sensory data is formless and it's imageless. That's what you're talking about.
I threw that out. By the way, I didn't say sensory data because I was taught by kids.
I know you didn't.
It's not data, it's information. Data is that stuff that Bob was talking about, and that he spent his life at Bell Labs manipulating, zeros and ones. But I'm sure Bob manipulated a lot of zeros and ones, except they're not really zeros and ones. They're on and off states in the computer, or states of a transistor or something. They're not even really zeros and ones, right, Bob?
Correct.
So anyway, we're not talking about data, it's information. But I kind of threw that out because it's true.
Invariants that are the, well, I don't want to say the basis, but it's the information of the invariants that offer perception the strongest case for direct perception.
Yeah, it's the invariants that underlie the invariants in stimulation. And we did talk about what some of those are, and we don't have time to redo that right now. I know we have that picture. We could. How much time we got? A minute? No minute. It's no time at all. So you have to look up invariant in Gibson. I like the what he called the horizon invariant of when an object comes towards you, the ratio when something's walking towards you, let's say a person, the ratio of that object above horizon to below horizon is invariant. It stays constant no matter whether it's far away or close, and gives you information that tells you it's an object of a certain size regardless of the visual angle. There, that's the best I could do in 20 seconds. So, Daniel, are we ready to go to? Yeah.
So we'll make a wrap.
Steve.
And
thanks
for joining us on ARC UK's channel, and we'll see you over on Clubhouse. And that's a wrap. Good day.
Thanks.